Hello and a very warm welcome to the Ideas Factory. I'm Naghma. Joining me is Professor Pant. The questions that we are looking at this week is Central Asia, definitely, because Ukraine continues to pose a big problem to the US as well as European countries because Russia, about 100,000 Russian troops are surrounding Ukraine, and there is a fear of uh, an increased tension or a possible invasion by Russia and Ukraine. And the backdrop of this situation, Russia and the US are also talking. Russians are also going to talk to all the NATO allies. So it's a really important conversation that is now happening there. The talks are going on, though it's very significant, but not much hope is pinned on these talks because people are not very hopeful of an outcome. Nevertheless, it is very significant that the two countries are talking right now. We'll also look at the crisis in Kazakhstan, and in that context, we will look at the growing footprint of Russia in Central Asia. Along with that, Chinese footprints in Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka is a classic example of the debt trap, of China's debt trap. How is Sri Lanka really going to come out of that crisis, and the situation in Myanmar? Also, India doing a tightrope walk there. So these are a few of the things that we will be looking at. All right, so to begin with, let's look at the situation in Ukraine. Ukraine continues to pose a problem for the US and the Western world as the Russian troops surround Ukraine. The situation there is tense, and a very significant talk is going on between US and Russia, Harsh. But do we hope for any outcome from these talks? They're significant nevertheless, but both sides have very widely different expectations. Russia has some demands. Russia wants the NATO forces to pull back and actually not go forward because Russia says that it was probably deceived after the Cold War and understood that NATO will not expand. So how do you look at this? Do you see the US's position here on Ukraine as its expansionist agenda and going forward in these erstwhile Soviet countries, or do you see this as Russia's maximalist agenda?
I think, Naghma, what is happening is that we are looking, we have, for a long time, we believed, or at least sections of the world believe, that geopolitics is over and geopolitics is not going to come back. And I think what we are witnessing today is geopolitics with Big Bang, whether it is Indo-Pacific, whether it is Eurasia, whether it is, I think, the old continent, which is Europe, where we are witnessing this contestation between Russia and the US at the moment, and the West at the moment. And I think it's classic, Cold War style jostling between the two powers, and this expectation that something positive will come out of this, perhaps maybe naive at this stage, but certainly what is interesting is that these conversations are happening, that there is an appetite on both sides to take these conversations forward, because I think both sides recognize that they need to work together in some ways to find a solution to this persistent problem. Now, the problem is very simple, that for Russia, its periphery is sacrosanct. It doesn't want to have any impact on, it doesn't want to see its security being jeopardized by American or Western forces along its near its borders. Now, in Eastern Europe, in Russia's periphery, what we have seen, and as you were mentioning, Russia has often complained that despite the assurances given at the end of the Cold War, those assurances have not been kept, and therefore now American forces, Western forces, NATO forces are very close to its border, something that it can't accept. And Ukraine and countries like Ukraine cannot be given that choice to accept NATO or to eventually become part of NATO if they should they so desire. And I think that is fundamentally a very geopolitical argument about one's security, and which is something I think will be contested and is being contested in Ukraine, and as we know, it is being contested in the West as well. The West, Americans are in no position or do not want to give any such guarantee to Russia that they would not expand, or that if Ukraine wants to join NATO, that they should simply veto. Russia should have a veto over Ukraine's choices. So I think at the moment these are seemingly irreconcilable positions. But what is interesting is that in their diplomatic statements, both America and Russian interlocutors have said that there are possibilities there. that some things can be worked out, though at the moment they seem very, very divergent. And of
Absolutely.
course, NATO and OSCE will also be holding their conversations with Russia. So it's a long week ahead, and perhaps a very important week, and perhaps it can lay down a marker in terms of how the geopolitical evolution of our times is going to shape up, because there are
Yes.
pressures on both sides.
Yes, they've called it a difficult talk. They've said it is a difficult talk, and there were no visible efforts to actually smooth over the sharp corners. But like you said, there'll be more round of talks. Europe is also a bit very harsh that should US give in a lot or concede a lot, because US has its own problems. It has to deal with the domestic challenges, be it COVID, be it economy, or the threat from China. So will US be in a position to put that kind of focus here in this region? And also President Putin has kind of already made some gains here, because he's got a platform at least to air his grievances and force Europe and US to engage with his agenda. So Europe's worry here, and how do you think, what role could EU have here?
Yes, this is, I think, a phenomenally clever move by Mr. Putin, because what he has done is essentially put, Europe in a corner. Not so much America, but Europe in a corner. And I think in some ways, what he's saying, that he has no intention of invading Ukraine, is also sensible, because there is no real need to Ukraine to invade Ukraine now that he has achieved most of what he wanted to achieve. He can still pressurize Ukraine. He still has control of Crimea. He still has parts of eastern Ukraine under his control, and with his military maneuvers, he has put enough strain in Ukraine, within Ukraine, and also created these red lines for other actors in the region. Those who at some point may perhaps think that joining NATO is a good option would rethink that option today. So I think that the whole shift that Mr. Putin has been able to accomplish in the region is very significant, and Europe in particular will be worried, because Europe certainly would not want a G2 happening here. It's a different kind of a G2 between Russians and the Americans, which leaves Europeans on their own. Now, Americans, of course, are giving these assurances that nothing is going to happen without Europeans present, nothing is going to happen without Ukrainians present there. But of course, major powers have their own logic of engaging with each other. And for America, the challenge, as you mentioned, is domestic. It is also strategic. I think Americans recognize the challenge of taking on two powers like Russia and China together. You really cannot take on China in the Indo-Pacific without finding a means of engaging Russians. And this is a point that India has often made, that I think, Americans are creating this axis, which the West can easily manage with greater degree of subtleness. And I think you only have to go back to the Cold War balance of power logic of Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon. They managed to win the Cold War by breaking the Chinese from the Soviet camp in 70s.
Mm-hmm.
Now, today you have a position where Russians and the Chinese are together. They are becoming developing a strategic partnership. And the challenge for the West, and particularly for the US, is that as they draw down on as they frame their strategic agenda by focusing on China as a peer competitor, Russia is actually something that they can leverage. But the strategic situation in the region, the domestic politics in America is such that any outreach to America becomes very difficult. To Russia becomes very difficult in the US, given Russia's involvement with Mr. Trump and the whole legacy of the Democratic establishment. So I think Mr. Biden here is taking some chances, and it would be, he would be hoping that he gets something out of it. But I think, of course, Europeans would be hoping that no decision is made without them being present there. And therefore, NATO and OSCE discussions this week will be equally important from their perspective, where they can lay down their own agenda and they can make sure that Americans are tethered to them rather than taking an independent position.
So, all right. We'll also look at Kazakhstan here, but before we move on to Kazakhstan and actually Russia's footprint there, or Russia playing a big role in the Kazakhstan crisis, resolving the crisis with the Russian troops flowing in to solve the crisis, which the president called a coup. Actually, the protest that Kazakhstan saw, all that has happened, and the way the Russian troops landed there, of course, at the president's request, it looks like, Moscow is back in a central role in Central Asia. And this is a matter of concern for many countries, including Turkey being one of them, prominently Turkey, because it is called a meeting of the foreign ministers of Turkey countries, online meeting happening there. Do you think Russia's footprints are right now all over Central Asia, and Russia seems to be back in a big way here?
Yes, I think again, Russia considers Central Asia as its periphery, and it is Russia's periphery. It has been under Russian, of course, Soviet control, and then under strict Russian guidance. Leaderships in Central Asia often have been taking their cues from Moscow, but what I think Kazakh experience has alerted the world to is that Central Asia, though it looks very stable from outside, remains a tinderbox of many, many issues that can explode anytime. And this is particularly a worry for Russia, because anything that happens in Central Asia has a direct bearing on Russian security. And given the fragility of, especially after the Afghanistan crisis, any fragility in Central Asia will be unacceptable to Russia. And therefore, we saw swift action. We saw CSTO, which is a regional treaty organization, coming into action, as part of which Russian troops went to Kazakhstan and have managed to create some semblance of stability for now. But I think for Russia, this is a key area. Russia has once again demonstrated that the kind of leverage, the kind of resources, the kind of strategic reach it has in this part of the world, no other power has. And this is a message not only to countries like Turkey, who have been trying to have an alternative engagement with some of these countries, but also to China, interestingly. Because we have often talked about China's growing footprint in Central Asia, but when the crunch comes, we can see how involved, how significant Russia remains for Central Asia and for the future stability of the region. Where you have not only Russia's involvement, but also I think a large part of the world would be hoping that something dramatic does not really happen in Central Asia, because again, oil and gas and mineral resources and the role that Central Asia plays in global economy comes into the picture.
Yes, so we will keep a watch on these talks that are taking place through this week. What would be the outcome? And in case there are no favorable outcomes, can Russia actually take a more aggressive position here? But if it does, then there will be serious consequences too for Russia. For example, as you mentioned, Harsh, there could probably be sanctions. The area can suffer because there could be sanctions on Putin's inner circle, as has been pointed out, or there could also be cancelling of Russia's Nord Stream 2 pipeline to Germany. All that can take place. But you also mentioned China's footprints here, but China's footprints are deeply entrenched in many parts of the world. For example, Sri Lanka. Look at what's happening in Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka is a classic example of China's debt trap. And the debt crisis now so huge that the president has been actually asking China for restructuring the debt. We've seen a meeting between the Chinese foreign minister and Mr. Gotabaya, but he's been hinting at, the Colombo Port City project, which was about $1.4 billion or so. Then he's been talking about the Hambantota port, which was built by China's help. This is a very strategic importance. This region has a strategic importance for India as well, and India has to really keep a watch on what's happening in Sri Lanka. Chinese footprints are deeply entrenched, of course, in the way Sri Lanka is trapped right now in the debt crisis.
Yes, I think Sri Lanka is particularly worrying case because this was a country that was actually doing very well economically before COVID-19 struck Sri Lanka. But I think there have been two problems. One, of course, is what we are talking about, COVID and its aftermath. Sri Lankan economy relying on tourism and tourism getting affected. So the larger economic paradigm getting affected. But also, I think there is a question of economic mismanagement in Sri Lanka, where we have seen a country that was doing well suddenly now finds itself at such a crisis where at multiple levels there are challenges. Whether you look at inflation, foreign exchange reserves, current account deficit, and a crisis of employment, I think for many in Sri Lanka and beyond, this would be something that part of that not only Sri Lankan policymakers have to take part of the blame, but also China, which as you mentioned, has been entering or has been trying to get Sri Lanka into projects which have become white elephants, where you have the debt trap, the debt restructuring argument that the Sri Lankan authorities have made recently to China. But it seems that debt restructuring is not really happening, because the Chinese foreign minister during his visit did not really commit himself to anything. What he basically outlined was that, look, we have these mega two-engine growth from Colombo port and Hambantota port, and look, this is something that Sri Lanka should involve itself more into the Asian supply chains and involve itself into the Asian economic architecture. But I think that the short-term problem is a real challenge, and we know that Sri Lanka has talked to India about it, and India, of course, there was also an episode with the fertilizer. The substandard fertilizer that was sold to Sri Lanka by Chinese company, and then there was India pitched in and helped Sri Lanka get over that crisis, in a short period of time. So I think, and of course, we have seen how Sri Lankan authorities have now been walking a tightrope between India and China, trying to bring India into the fold, recognizing I think that the role that India can potentially play in the economic revival of Sri Lanka. So there are these. The China-India competition will be with us for a very long time. But what India can do is to help its neighbors at the time of crisis and project itself as a country that will always stand by them through thick and thin, unlike some other countries that can come in and move out depending on their own temporary interests. But what is also interesting, perhaps, where many in India would be thinking about, is that this should not become a pattern. That you end up, India's neighbors end up doing deals which are economically unsustainable, and then when the crunch hits, it is India that comes to their aid. Because if this becomes a pattern, this will not only be, I think, bad for decision making, economic decision making in the region, but it also affects India's relations with its immediate neighbors. So I think there are a whole host of broader issues that are embroiled in what is happening in Sri Lanka at the moment, and one hopes that Sri Lanka's economic revival happens fast, so that Sri Lanka can can pursue a balanced economic policy, but also approach India and China through more sustainable lenses, rather than looking at rather than trying to always play one off against the other.
But there's a problem in another neighborhood. Myanmar has a problem, and Myanmar had very short-lived democracy, and since last year there has been pro-democracy protests as well, and now with the fresh sentences against Aung San Suu Kyi, India has to do a tightrope walk there too, with opposition leader already under house arrest, and the pro-democracy protests are growing. But if a civil war-like situation takes place there, then it can spill over to India, which shares its borders with Myanmar, and the northeastern states of Mizoram is there. Manipur is there. So there's a problem there, and we've seen a recent visit by Foreign Secretary Harshvardhan Shringla, which was to actually engage more constructively in Myanmar. The West has criticized what's happening in Myanmar. India has criticized too, and said very clearly that it's pro-democracy. But India has to actually look at both sides, and it's in a more difficult situation where it has to balance between the current rule as well as the pro-democracy protesters and the leaders.
Yes, I think India's task is much more difficult than I think the West. The West, does not have Myanmar as a neighbor, and they can take a black and white approach. We're talking about sanctions all the time, but sanctions cannot become the single most important vehicle of managing, the winds of change that are sweeping Myanmar. Now, the issue there is fundamentally an institutional one. The evolution of political democracy has not been as stable as many had expected, and now that the military junta is back in control, they've been trying to marginalize Aung San Suu Kyi against popular will. Now, it's clearly not sustainable. But at the moment, given the matrix of issues that India is engaged with when it comes to Myanmar, India simply can't take the position that the West has taken, that look, you have to move towards democracy, and unless you move towards a democratic form of government, we will sanction you. India has to engage whoever is running the government there. Because, as you mentioned, not only because of what is happening within Myanmar, but also because of the borders, our border stability, and also because I think in a fundamental way, China has been the most important beneficiary of West isolating Myanmar. The more West has tried to isolate Myanmar's military government, the more entrenched China has become. In fact, if you look at Chinese investments in infrastructure, even in the last few months, even in the last year, since we have had the military government, it has grown exponentially. Now, so therefore, for India, this is a situation which India has to take into account, which India has to consider, and therefore India has to engage with all stakeholders, including the military government there, and that's why I think Foreign Secretary's visit last month to Myanmar was an important one, because I think it laid down a marker that, look, in New Delhi is interested in democratic transition. We want all stakeholders to come to the table and have a negotiated settlement. But at the same time, like Japan, like members of ASEAN, we are also interested in ensuring that isolation, that sanction do not become the only means of engaging with the Myanmarese government. And so I think India's approach remains more nuanced than say the West. And hopefully West will see the costs of simply taking a unidimensional approach to the Myanmarese question.
Yes, of course, West can probably afford to take a unidimensional approach, but India stands to be more nuanced, and it is more nuanced. Harsh, we're going to take a question from one of our viewers. Suraj Singh asks a question about Indo-Pacific and the growing role of Indo-Pacific in shaping world politics, and he asks, is there any chance that India would play a leading role? How it will ensure its own interest?
Of course, we have talked about Indo-Pacific a lot, and Indo-Pacific is, at the moment, the center of gravity of global politics, global economics, global strategy. Everything is shifting, if not already shifted to the region. I think India, by its very geographical position, is the nodal actor here. In India's resilience and India's economic profile, India's geographical location, India's partnerships make it a pivotal actor in the emerging Indo-Pacific geopolitical landscape. I think large part of this would depend on how China plays its cards. If China remains as aggressive, as belligerent, as antagonistic to most regional actors, then there is a fair chance that India will build even more powerful, even stronger partnerships with like-minded countries. And I think in some ways, those partnerships, those networks allow India to leverage some of its traditional strengths in the region much more effectively. For a long time, India was primarily seen as an Indian Ocean, South Asian country. Now I think there is an increasing recognition that India's role in the wider Indo-Pacific cannot be ignored, and the balance of power can only be sustained if India is at the heart of developing networks and developing structures like the Quad and some of the others that are emerging. So I think India's role is very natural in the Indo-Pacific, and hopefully India will be in a position to play that role as the world moves out of the COVID-induced health crisis and also the wealth crisis, and the Indo-Pacific strategic landscape evolves much more dramatically over the next few years, India's role cannot be ignored, and India will continue to play a much more robust role, given that India wants to play a leading role in international relations, as articulated by its policymakers.
Absolutely. So thank you so much, Harsh, for that conversation. And let's remind our viewers that they can send in questions, and some of your questions will be answered on the next episode. That's it from us on this episode of the Ideas Factory. Thank you for watching.
Thank you.